to me and said to others, I want a normal country. I want a democratic country with the market economy, and I want normal relations with the world. I said, absolutely wonderful. This is exactly what we want. And, you know, Gaidar, who was then the acting premier of Russia, which was about to become the sovereign country, was meeting with the G7 finance deputies in November 1991. And Russia was running out of foreign exchange reserves. This was a fulminant financial crisis. So I knew a lot about financial crises and their history and their resolution, and worked with Poland a couple of years before. And I suggested to Gaidar, well, look, tell the US and the other six deputy finance ministers, you need a standstill on the debt payments because you're running out of reserves. And Russia's about to become an independent country, and we can't have a financial collapse. And he came out of the meeting just absolutely ashen-faced. He said they wouldn't even consider it. They said, you have to pay to the penny. We will not allow anything right now. We're not authorized to allow anything. We will not allow anything. You continue to pay. Russia ran out of reserves at the beginning of 1992 as Yeltsin came to power. In other words, a fulminant financial crisis. I couldn't believe it. I spent 2 unbelievably frustrating years trying to get the US and the IMF to do something, and they wouldn't do anything. And Larry Eagleburger, who was acting Secretary of State, explained to me at one point, said, Mr. Sachs, it's not even about what you're advising. Even if I agreed with it, it's not going to happen. And he said, you know, this is an election year. It's not going to happen. And the truth is, you know, this didn't determine all the future, but God, did it show an attitude of obtuseness in the United States. And I didn't appreciate then that Cheney and Wolfowitz were working on their great neocon illusions that now we're the sole superpower, now we get to do what we want. And they really were working on the next wars because they were going to take away every Soviet ally or Russian ally in the Middle East, knock out Libya, Syria, Iraq. This was a plan already from the early 1990s, according to Wesley Smith. And I didn't know it at the time. I just couldn't believe here we are, this historic moment, a chance to cooperate. No, we're not going to cooperate. We're going to be the sole superpower. And I just found that obtuseness year after year from the U.S. And by the end of the 1990s, I basically had it because I had seen the U.S. now from all sides. I had seen it from the Latin American perspective. I had seen it from the Central European perspective. I'd seen it from the Russian perspective. I'd seen it from the Indonesian perspective in 1997. We just were not a cooperative country that aimed to work with other countries to solve problems. We were the unipolar great power of the world. We were arrogant, and we were not paying attention to what other countries said. And this manifested itself in a number of financial debacles of these countries that had big effects on the world. It also manifested in what brings us to the war in Ukraine today. Though this is a very unpopular view, it's right, and that is NATO enlargement. What John Mearsheimer has said is right. Kissinger said it, and so many other wise people. George Kennan said it in 1997. Don't do this NATO enlargement. It'll lead to a new Cold War. Now we have a hot war. The Secretary of Defense under Clinton was deciding whether to resign or not when he learned that Clinton indeed would go ahead with NATO enlargement, because Bill Perry who was the Secretary of Defense, said, look, we're starting to improve relations with Russia. Do we really need to risk that right now by peremptory moves of NATO enlargement, especially since unequivocally both the Germans and the Americans had promised Gorbachev and then Yeltsin no enlargement in return for German reunification. Then we lied about it. Well, it's not in writing. We brought out all our lawyers. But good historians know that those commitments were made. And we just want to deny that. And given, the predominance of U.S. government in our media, you can tell any story you want. This is absolutely true. But the long and the short of it, Rob, is that NATO enlargement started. We weren't giving any financial help. We were plotting wars against Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Assad, all the allies of the former Soviet Union, or of the Soviet Union, and then of Russia. Russia has military naval base in Syria, so Assad would be our target, and so forth. No cooperation other than superficial. And in the 1990s, the NATO enlargement started. And then during George W. Bush, well, actually, Clinton did something that, in retrospect, we didn't even see the significance of, but it was hugely significant and misguided. And that was the war against Serbia in 1999 to force Serbia to give up Kosovo. So there was a rebellion of Kosovar Albanians, or Albanian Kosovars, I should say, in Serbia. And the U.S. took sides and said, let them break away. And when Serbia said, no, they're part of Serbia, which is the normal way that diplomacy works, the U.S. bombed Belgrade for several weeks. And we set up the precedent that if you want a breakaway state or you want to weaken the other side, just go bomb them. And then when Russia says, well, when we do this, we're called the crime of humanity, but when NATO does it, that passes as defending freedom fighters. So isn't there no standard or a double standard? But just to carry on to the current day, in the early 2000s, after the Belgrade bombing, and then after 9/11, of course, Bush pushed the enlargement of NATO to, I think, 7 countries under his watch, an extraordinary increase of the number of countries. The Baltic states, to begin with, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, if I remember correctly, all during Bush's watch. And then to the shock of the Europeans in NATO in 2008, he said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And just take a look at a map. And I encourage everybody to take a look at the map of the Black Sea. What was NATO's idea? What was the U.S. strategic idea? The U.S. strategic idea was basically to own the Black Sea for NATO, because you'd have Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and where's Georgia? All the way over on the eastern side of the Black Sea suddenly is going to be a NATO country, whereas NATO was originally to defend against an invasion by a now defunct, non-existent country in Western Europe. So suddenly it is an expansionary force moving straight across the Black Sea. It reminds me a lot of the Crimean War of the 19th century. Who controls the Black Sea? And, well, one thing has led to another, and we have the war in Ukraine. And if in our media you say, the United States played a provocative war, you're immediately targeted. Oh, you're just purveying Putin's propaganda. Well, this is really nonsense. We need a serious discussion, some context, some history, and we should not have pushed NATO right up against Russia's edge and right around the encirclement of the Black Sea. But we did so, and now we're also paying consequences for this, but especially Ukraine is paying consequences for this.